previous conversation, right? We saw the previous panel discuss in length about the various user conversion funnels, how to improve retention in each of them. Now let's deep dive and talk about yet another aspect of driving funnel conversions. That is experimentation. Experimentation is not a thing that you do, it is how you do things. Brands successfully using experimentation to drive business results have shifted from myopic metrics like order conversion rate to holistic measurements of customer success like NPS scores and of course, taking care of the entire customer lifetime value. Now, these organizations, the one that experiment continuously on their problems and find out the problems that are most worth solving across the entire customer journey, are the ones which are most likely to achieve as well as exceed the product market fit. So to discuss this in depth, we have senior product and growth leaders across B2C brands on our very next panel that you can see on your screen. To drive data-driven experiments on mobile app and to maximize funnel conversions. Let's quickly meet our panelists. Our first panelist is Amit Bhatnagar. He's Chief Product Officer at Dineout. Hey, hi Amit.
Hey, hi Akansha, hi everyone.
Welcome to the MarTech Mashup, Amit. I'm just going to quickly introduce you. Amit comes with a rich and extensive experience of 14 years across startups and large companies in India and the United States. Prior to Dineout, Amit served in a product leadership role at Oyo, for Apple Maps at Apple, and for Bing at Microsoft in the US. Quickly moving ahead to the next speaker, we also have Vikas Vardhan Soni in the room. He's the AVP Products for Head Digital Work. Hey, hi Vikas, how are you doing?
Hi Akanksha. Hi, I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here.
I'm glad. Vikas, quickly, a quick introduction for you for the audience. Vikas is a passionate product leader and a strategic business professional with over 15 years of multi-locational and multi-role experience running across products, management, analytics, business management, and engineering roles. Vikas has been delivering scalable business solutions for global markets. Moving on to our third panelist today, we also have Nitish with us. He's the Head of Product and Strategy at MyTeam11. Hey Nitish, welcome to the MarTech Mashup.
Thank you, Kangsha. Hi, everybody. Happy to be here.
We're glad, Nitish. Nitish is the product management professional with 12 years of experience. He believes in building products that drive exceptional customer experience. A practitioner of agile principle and people leadership, Nitish uses his ability to strike balance between technical and business requirements to drive large-scale projects from idea to market collaborating with cross-functional teams. Moving to the last but not the least, we also have Deepak Krishnan, Senior Director of Product Management and the Head of Growth at Myntra. Hey Deepak, welcome to the MarTech Mashup.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. Pleasure to be here.
Good afternoon, Deepak. For our audience, Deepak brings 12 years of experience in product and growth leadership. He's worked with FreeCharge, Zynga, and has founded multiple startups. Deepak loves to build products and companies at scale that transform people's life for better. I think I'm really glad to have all the panelists in the room, and I'm just going to deep dive into our discussion now. Started to just set the context, right? Experimentation is not a thing that you do, it's how you do things. And I already, spoke about it. But this brings to the most obvious point that it is not confined to a certain team. It requires a company-wide culture, right? If it's something that has to be done. It is not a new concept. Everybody nowadays is practicing, doing experimentation at scale, but how to conduct experiments is the key, and that changes the entire context. So I want to extend the first question to everybody in the forum, because I know all of you will have your very personal anecdotes and experiences in this, but what are the most important things to do to build a culture of experimentation, and how you are doing it in your organizations, and how do you define and conduct experiences? So I love to, maybe I have Amit, on the screen first. So Amit, if you would want to take that up.
Sure, great question, Akansha. So basically, a lot goes into creating the culture of data and experimentation. I would say, especially when you are kind of building it from scratch, as would be the case, let's say, when companies are transitioning from being, let's say, a sales first and op first organization to a data first organization. Or in some cases, when the companies are like getting founded, right? A lot goes into this. I would say two of my favorite things. So one is basically institutionalized data, democratized data. Do not compartmentalize it basically in hands of just a few. So basically what I mean about that when I say that is, so what happens is that sometimes data and experimentation, and I think most of our panelists probably would agree, we are on the other side basically, which is guilty of somewhat doing this. Basically, this become a tools in the hands of the usual suspects: product managers, product analysts, decision scientists, growth managers, right? And while it may not be the intention, it is never our intention. But sometimes people outside this core group start seeing data and validation and experimentation as weapons in the hands of a few who brandish it every time they need to object to an idea. And what companies need to do over here is they need to build a culture where data is accessible, understood, and applicable by every key stakeholder. So basically, if I specifically take the example over here at Dineout. So at Dineout, our cultural values, they spell out, we love food. I mean, we seriously do love food, but specifically here, each letter in this basically sentence that stands for a key value, and specifically E stands for experimentation and innovation. This started basically as a set of cultural values for the product team, and we presented when we the product team presented it to the complete leadership. They were very clear. Yes, these may be the values of the product team, but these need to be the value for the company. And now basically we have adopted these values, including experimentation and innovation, as a part of Dineout company culture. So basically, if I go deeper into what we have done for this, so basically a few months ago, we had a data literacy and data proficiency certification program. I think it was from Upgrade, if I remember correctly, which had participation, of course, from product growth and other teams, but it even had participation from sales, from marketing, from support team, because the idea is basically the data needs to be understood by everybody. We are now gradually making basically the data, our dashboards, to accessible to everybody who wants to know about it, from basically need to know basis to basically everybody who cares about it. The idea over here is basically, as I conclude my first point over here, the idea is not everybody needs to know the how of experimentation, the how of data, but everybody needs to know the why of data and experimentation. Everybody needs to know the vocabulary of basically data and experimentation. So that's the first part, make data front and center of your organization. The second part, somewhat counterintuitively, maybe not. So basically the idea over here is, what is, when I say maybe not, the idea is that we need to have a balanced approach. We need to know when experimentation is king, when experimentation basically is important, when we are ready for experimentation. But at the same time, we also need to be ready that, hey, there are times when we need to challenge whether we are doing it right, whether it is right to do experimentation. Let me elaborate a bit on this. So basically, in general, it makes sense to to let the experimentation rule. Let it make decisions for us. It will surprise. It will befuddle at times. It can even ruffle a few feathers. I personally know a very good friend of mine working in United States, working for one of the world's largest hotel chain. He ended up making his VP of marketing extremely angry by proving basically her ideas wrong to the power of experimentation. So that's what I mean when I say experiment can surprise, it can befuddle, it can confuse at times, right? And this is usually not the bad thing. Even if it ruffles a few feathers, that's all right. Sometimes that is needed to build that culture that we are talking about, right? But at the same time, we also need to understand that I think when it comes to data revolution, I think I would say that probably 80 years later, 70 years later, we would say, hey, we were nowhere when it comes to data and experimentation in 2021. And that's what we need to realize. We are just getting started. Sometimes there may not be sufficient data to conclude. Sometimes experimentations are not done right. Sometimes the right metric may not be chosen. And that's why basically when I say that maybe we should not always make data front and center of everything, the idea is we should be ready to challenge ourselves. We need to challenge our experimentation. Just to quote a quick example, at Bing, basically, we used to run experimentation, literally multiple experimentations on a daily basis. For one particular experimentation, CTR, the click-through rate was through the roof, and we were thought that here we have found a winner. Till we decided to include one more experiment, so one more metric, that was a quick back rate, that somebody clicks on it, feels that no, this is not the page I want, and hits back. And it was very, very clear, no, this was not an experience we want to show to the user. So even if at a large company with a well-established culture, we could actually have made a very, very wrong decision if we did not have the liberty to try give it another shot. I think that is what I mean by basically that we should be ready to challenges as needed. So yeah, so these are the two things from my side to build the right culture about data and experimentation, make it basically an important part of the company culture, but at the same time, be ready to challenge the results from data and experimentation as needed.
Thank you, Amit. I see a lot of patience, data, dealing with data with a lot of patience and acceptance that is required from your learnings. I'm just going to request Nitish for his views. Nitish, if you want to take this lead.
Thank you, Kanchan. It's a question that is very dear to my heart as well. I've been a data analyst for a significant part of my life, and I think I can understand when Amit was pointing out that democratizing the data, especially for every single person in the organization, is a huge part of building a culture around experimentation. And he has already spoken at length about it, so I'm not going to get into too much details, except saying that we are also building the same kind of technologies and tools and making the data available for our widespread a group of employees, and not just people specific to certain roles like product leaders and growth leaders. Other important things that I also believe are part of building an experimentation culture is having the ability to digest failures. I think it's very easy to say that we have stakeholder buy-in when we are doing experimentation, but it's very different when those matrices start showing some really random numbers, and like some of their experimentation are not yielding different results as you expected. So really getting the buy-in from your executives and your stakeholders is extremely important, and making them aware of those things in advance, that hey, some of these experiments will go kaput, will lead us to some dark paths, really, but that's not the purpose of this. Like what we are trying to identify is that one real winner out of this, and like we should all be accepting the failures as well. So the principle that we live by is fail fast and learn fast, and I think that has yielded strong results for us. Like our ideas, our point of experimentations are usually trying to keep the blast radius limited for any new experiment that we run. As soon as we are able to identify some key learnings, like keep a constant feedback loop into the experimentation system and like keep it churning and adjusting the key matrices, as Amit also pointed out, like CTR along with the clickback rates is a very important metric. So like adjusting your success criteria is as equally important when you're identifying your and setting up your experimentation culture. I think a couple of other things that we have found success with is setting audacious and impossible goals, which may feel very difficult in the beginning. Like, for example, like just take an example of United States itself. Like in 1960, the president declared that in 10 years we will be on the moon. It felt like a very impossible and audacious goal at that point of time, and they had absolutely no clue of how they're going to do it. But eventually they achieved it, and in 1969 they landed a rocket on the moon. So, like I think setting those audacious and impossible goals at least gives you a glimpse of like what the future could be looking like, what exactly you're aiming for. And in the meantime, like you will fail, obviously. Like, so before Apollo 13 landed, like there were 12 Apollo missions that failed. So having aversion to like changing your theories based on different failures is very important. Executive buy-ins and then setting audacious goals are the key things, along with the data part, are important for setting up the cultural experimentation.
You very well pointed out the failure and the feedback loop, how important it is to study that also, right? Because that is also a result in a way. It's not a failure. Ideally, it's actually what you shouldn't do. And I mean, that's a very, very important point. And I just want to take Vikas's view. Vikas, any thoughts on this, the culture of experimentation? How do you do it at HDWorks?
Yeah, so I think I'll taking a cue from where Nitish left. I mean, I will take a step back and I'll say there is a tectonic shift when you move from I know to I will find out. This is a very big tectonic shift, and companies wherein you have got leaders who have been staying in this business for a long time. So, and certainly there is a bias for action because you need to make things move and appear things moving. But that's where experimentation comes in quite handy, wherein you tell them try to make smaller moves, measure the parameters, what all are there, and and then figure out like what works and what doesn't work. But if you'll take there are teams which are ops in nature, very much occupied on the floor running stuff for a gaming business per se, I would say, because those guys they have an appetite for experimentation. But for them, the kind of tools and the kind of flexibility you need to create as tech is much more than simply somebody sitting in the product team who has got abundant amount of data and amount of technology people at disposal to run stuff. So what I've seen at Head Digital from where I've picked up in 2016 to what I've done now, there is we have created a recurring experimental setup which helps them run smaller pieces of experiments on their own, or independent technological setups which they can run on their own. So this is an experiment which they run for their stuff. If you talk about the broad strategic experiments which are run to take the direction of the company, therein you need to build up a lot of tech strengths and flexibilities. It's all about your flexibility of your infrastructure. You need to give up the bias that I know. If these two things come into place together, then you got an environment wherein your experimentation culture can flourish.
Thank you, Vikas. And yes, I mean, we're all human beings. We come with those biases, and only data brings us back to the place and shows us the reality. So, you very rightly put that. We have Deepak also. Deepak, very interesting. It would be very interesting to know your view, how we do it at Myntra. Any lights on those?
Sure. So I think what Amit, Vikas, and Nitish have covered, right, in terms of why we do experimentation. I think at the end of the day, it's all about democratization of decision making, right? And for all of us to learn really fast. I think I conducted a poll yesterday just to be curious as to why people conduct. Surprisingly, everyone is focusing on the goal, but the real reason is you want to learn, and there's so much about the consumer and the markets that are constantly changing. There's no one single individual who has deep enough understandings. And that's why you want to democratize and empower your team members to have a framework to make choices and make those choices really fast. And those unlock new learnings. And that is the key to your innovation. But once that starts happening, right, there's a new set of problems that start coming in, right? There's only so much bandwidth that every organization has. And then it then goes from why do we do experimentation to how do we do experimentation, right? And that comes a new set of challenges, right? What is the right set of processes that you put? How do you come up with your hypothesis? How do you pick up the right metrics? How do you ensure there's a right balance of your portfolio? Because once you say everyone in the organization has the power to make a choice, right? You have hundreds of people who want to put forward a hypothesis, right? But there's only so much bandwidth. How do you then pick the right kind of experiments? How do you prioritize them, right? And most importantly, how do you conclude these experiments, right? So there has to be a set of very strong processes. And I think most importantly, experimentation science, while it's widely open, and I think a lot of us are aware about it, I think there are very deep nuances of how to conduct an experiment, design an experiment, and infer an experiment. And that's where there's a lot of backlash that happens, right? People think that A/B testing or an experiment is a simple case of just splitting up traffic and inferring the results. But there's so many things that can go wrong in it. As a consequence, you could make a lot of faulty inferences that could set you down the right path. So it's really important that when we talk about experimentation culture, it's not only important to talk about why we do it, how do you do it, and do you have adequate knowledge to make meaningful inferences? Otherwise, you could end up making a lot of bad democratized decisions and you might not move in the right direction. So a lot of caveats there. Very powerful tool, but we should be very mindful of how to use this tool. It's an extremely powerful way of decision making and bringing innovation and speed to organizations. So that would be how I look at experimentation.
Deepak, very interesting. You mentioned the big word A/B test here already, and I know there would be a lot of caveats. It's a It's a word which is used by so many people today, and it's about, you mentioned a very important bit on how to do that and what not to do and what not to do. I'm gonna come back to you to discuss that more in detail. But Amit, we just talking about this, and I want to take this question up with you. We spoke to different organizations and how their different approaches changes, right? Vikas told us, Nitish also gave us the word, even being from the gaming industry, the approaches are different. And you have worked with some fairly large organizations like Microsoft and Apple, two growth stage startups as well, that is Oyo and now Dyna. So do you think for the companies, like we're just discussing about cultures, but even with the size and stature of the companies, how is the approach different? Have you seen the approach altogether being different? And if you want to throw some lights on that.
Akansha, these are two very very different worlds, very different different worlds. So I'll share some examples of it. So basically, in general, I would say the big companies, and again, I'm talking about the big companies, like really large companies. They have a bit of a definitive advantage. Fair or unfair, I think that's a debate for later. Maybe they have earned that, but basically, fair or unfair aside, but they definitely have a definite advantage when it comes to data and experimentation. They have the right infrastructure. They have the right mindset. Nobody needs to be convinced over there, basically, that yes, the decision need to be data driven. They have bigger data pool to basically to start on experimentation. You start with a solid hypothesis. For that, you have bigger data pool to basically form a solid hypothesis to begin with. They have a larger set of users. They have an ability to run multiple experiments all at the same time. They can even start with a good data-driven hypothesis, start with somewhat a risky proposition, expose it only to a very fraction of their overall user set, 0.5%, 0.3%, and still basically they can achieve statistically significant results very very early, because their 0.3%, 0.2% is a very very large set of users, right? So basically, if I put my time from my time at Bing, uh, so sometimes we would see Google experimenting with certain things, certain tweaks. Sometimes maybe our UX research team would come up with a, hey, can we change the color of the ad labels from, let's say, green to a golden or something like this? And for tweaks like this, which was like which were quick win kind of thing, which did not require elaborate feature development, sometimes what would happen is that we may be able to, that okay, the idea came in, we would launch an experiment, get near conclusive results in less than 24 hours, sometimes even the same day, but we usually preferred basically a complete 24 hours, so that we have a basically good representation of, let's say, in the early morning searcher, afternoon searcher, office searcher, late night searcher, and all. We usually preferred at least 24 hours, but very soon in a lot of cases, in just around 5 to 6 hours, we would have near conclusive results, which would not get overturned within 24 hours, right? And we would know that. And we used to lament at that time that, hey, Google does have an unfair data advantage over us, because of course Google is basically in terms of the size of data, in terms of basically the quality of data, everything basically, Google was with a few multiples of us basically, right? And I lamented about that till I entered the startup world. Startups are a very different ball. So basically, if I talk about, so basically at Oyo, I've handled B2B side for quite some time, and then basically the B2C side. And at Dineout, I'm managing both B2B and B2C product lines, right? So if I talk just about the B2C side to begin with and come to B2B in a moment, both Oyo and Dineout have a sizable number of B2C users. Oyo is basically one of the world's largest hotel chains, at least the largest hotel app you can say. And Dineout is basically India's largest restaurant reservation platform, one of the top basically you can say top 3 or 4 food tech companies in India. But even at this scale, I would be basically honest in admitting experimentation is not really a solved problem. It wasn't a solved problem at Oyo. It isn't a solved problem in B2C. Sorry, in Dineout B2C. So basically, first we need to build the appetite for failure, understanding of that. Yes, why we need to do this. I think that we are past that point now at Dineout. We were well past at that point at Oyo gradually. We need to set the infrastructure. Sometimes even when a near conclusive results comes, we would need to revisit the assumption. That was the thing that I was talking about at the starting. At OYO, once we actually did uncover an anomaly about the traffic split on A/B test. How did we uncover this? Because the results were more counterintuitive than basically what we would have expected. Now, the thing about that is that since we questioned it only when they were just too counterintuitive, that basically brings the whole point into the question that, hey, should we treat it with complete sanctity? Should we challenge it? And that's why my answer is that yes, we should continue challenging it till we know that yes, now if the data split is right, the basically data if the test group and the base group are more or less good representation of each other, we should continue challenging it. Even when all of that is done, sometimes it does take, let's say, around 2 to 3 days to get a statistically significant result, sometimes even more than that, especially if it's a relatively high risk experiment that you do not want to expose to everybody. So yeah, so that's on the B2C side, which again, as I said, is very sizable. Talking about the B2B side, which basically I would say the challenges that I am highlighting over here when it comes to startup, B2B side, especially when you combine these two things, B2C and startups, right? The challenges are even tougher. So basically, the user base is very often when you are at a startup, the user base is in a few hundreds, maybe early thousands at max. Even this user set is not homogeneous that you can say that, yeah, this group, this 20% group, this 80% group, yes, this 20% roughly represents the other 80%. If I talk specifically about Dineout B2B, I'll tell you the kind of diverse customers that that are represented in our B2B portfolio. So we have a large chain called Wingstop from United Arab Emirates. It's a global chain, but the Wingstop UAE is the one which is our customer. We have a biryani chain called Begums from Oman. We have Indian giants, Bikanerwala, Haldiram, and Theobroma, right? We have some very smaller restaurants as well. Probably, unless you are from the city, you would not have heard from, let's say, Ranu's Kitchen or from Ahmedabad, Hops and Taters from Jaipur. These are basically very different set of customers, diversified in terms of geography, diversified in terms of size, right? Very difficult to split basically an A/B test between these two set of users and try to claim that yes, these are my test base is still representative of the overall population. And that's why basically, while I would say that we have kind of kicked off some experimentation on the B2C side, we have, as of now, we are far from saying that on the B2B side, we are completely data and experimentation driven. We try to be customer driven for sure. We do conduct usability studies, we do conduct customer interviews and all those things. But when it comes to experimentation and all, I would say that we are kind of just getting started on the B2B side. And that was the case, just to be clear, at OYO B2B as well. So, but just to be clear, I mean, this what I just said may come as a dampener to something that, hey, if I'm a B2B customer or if you're a startup, probably I'm not ready for experimentation. No, that's not the case. I often say over here, internally also I say that the key to success through experimentation is to keep in mind that even when you are 20 to 30% driven by data, when you are even 22%, your experimentation are driving 20 to 30% of your decisions. For the rest, you are still being data driven by intelligent guesstimates, but maybe not through experimentation, right? That is still a huge leap. Still a huge leap over pure intuition driven decisioning. And very importantly, it is in the right step that if you want to be one of those big companies that basically you aspire to be, then basically you need to keep on moving 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, maybe not all the way to 100, but you need to keep growing in that direction. So that's what I would say my experience across smaller growth stage companies, large companies has taught me about data and experimentation.
But just very different worlds, different problems, and you know that completely now I can understand the fact that how it will be and the kind of learnings that every stage would have. It's not just that, and I think I'd love to take Vikas's view on this, because just like different companies, Amit has dealt with, because in your case, you're dealing with multiple apps, like multiple games, multiple products within the same organizations or different. Would you have any specific or best use case that you've seen that has done wonders with the help of entire experimentation, and anything from the gaming world that you would want to share with us?
Yeah. So, what I would say, gaming is one industry that's not devoid of data. There is a plethora of data available, and sometimes we feel like we are in the sea of data and don't know, like it's an overabundance problem we have. But still, I would say, when it comes to the gaming world and experimentation, I personally manage something which is into real money gaming, something which is into social gaming. Uh, if you take a real money gaming app, there the lines are very, very clearly defined about the gaming controls. I mean, nobody personally would like, you won't like your bank to do an experiment with you on your key controls about where you deposit cash and where you withdraw cash. I mean, these are pretty much standard areas. So we have got kind of defined lines in which we can do an extensive experimentation. We have kind of lines wherein we have to carefully plan our experiments and take smaller sets and do multiple runs. The second business which I kind of manage is a fantasy business, which is a derivative business over sports. I think like Nitishs is doing it. So there, what happens is you get a very limited window, and you have to be very, very, very careful when you're planting your experiments, and you have to also see what kind of audience you are playing around with, because sometimes there is a bright chance if the audience which only comes to you during a match event and it gets irritated, you will be answerable to many more people. But on the third side, as I said, which is pure play social gaming side, I mean, people are there for entertainment. So the amount of experimentation I'm able to drive over there is much, much more. I can change things. I can see the review. I can go into a parallel experiment. I can go into sequential experiments or switchback experiments, or what kind of experiments, like the 4 or 5 types which you typically use it. But the appetite is much, much, much more. But as Deepak also pointed out, when you drive experiments, after a while you figure out, as I told, like we have got a separate analytics setup from where my operation teams directly park experiments, and what happens is experiments starts colliding with each other. So a treatment group, if it has gotten two treatment groups has got the same audience, it becomes difficult to figure out what has actually caused the desired result or why the experiment failed. So this is a problem I am in right now, trying to figure out what can be done. For an example, if I would say churn prediction is something which is very important in a gaming world, because we have got highly engaged users, and when they move out, they take away a lot of money from the plate. So I'll give an example about how we started the churn prediction thingy. We had a pretty robust machine learning model which spits out these are the kind of users who might churn. But and we had a pretty much standard offer which goes to a person who has a propensity to churn out of the system. But over a period in time, we realized that the bigger group of customers who are falling into the block of people about to churn, it has got multiple behavioral parameters. And that's where we started experimenting, trying to put in more functional parameters, identifying which all are the different segments and how that segment might differ, how the offer can to that segment might differ over a period in time. With that, I would say we are able to achieve approximately 40-50% efficiency over our past numbers on the retention front.
That's great, because I mean that's very interesting. And as you mentioned, right, there is no scarcity of data at your front. And since we are talking about games, I want to go to Nitish, because as you mentioned, right, the window is smaller, it's very static, real time. And Nitish, I think while there could be various use cases, but I hope you agree and you can correct me, but the biggest challenge is that money deposit conundrum, right? How is MyTeam11 addressing it? And if you could throw some lights on that.
So thank you, Kancha, for the question. So first of all, I think, yes, while the biggest challenge is money deposit conundrum, like we don't start the problem statement from there. We look at essentially we are a freemium platform. We offer free models as well as paid games as well. So for us, the most important thing is like once the customer has used the platform or not. Like if they have used the platform, the probability of them say paying for the platform automatically increases if they're shown interest in playing any kind of contest. So our very first experiment starts the moment the customer onboards, and our push is to make them play any contest And we try to use a lot of personalization matrices in that to sort of nudge them into the direction of, let's say, for example, like from your attribution data, we are identifying that you're in this particular age group. There is a high likelihood chance that if there is an India game today, especially if a T20 game, like you will be interested in playing that game, right? So like we match you to the nearest opponent in that particular contest, and like we sort of give you options to participate in those contests. Once you have played that free contest, then we start sort of pushing into the direction of like if you had played this paid contest, then this is how much you could have won. And if on the flip side the user is not actually winning, then we basically start coaching them like how to play the teams, like what are the things that we can give you. Like we have fantasy predictions through Sports Tiger. These are the things that you can do. Like this is where you identify the player's stats, and like this is how you basically hone your skill to essentially become a better player of the games and eventually convert into a paying customer. So once we have seen that the tenacity of the player of the customer is increasing, they are participating in more and more contests. That's when converting them into and sort of pushing them to deposit cash becomes much easier. And even in depositing cash, like we use a lot of personalized offers for based on different geographies, different regions. The communication is always on a very regional and personal basis. And we have seen those things like resulting like 8 to 10% more customers depositing money as compared to like last year in terms of number of users acquired, which has meant like although like for fantasy sports, pandemic year was not that great. In spite of being in real money gaming and contrary to the industry where RMG grew exponentially, like fantasy sports suffered a lot because there were no sports for 6 months. In spite of those things, like we didn't take that much hit on the revenue because we were focusing on the personalization, and it gave us the time to build our experimentation abilities. One of the things that we have recently started doing is deploying models to identify your ability to pay in last minute. Like so, for example, like entry fee for a particular contest is 45 rupees, and I see that you already have 40 rupees in your wallet which you can deposit. And I know that Akanksha say is an avid customer. Like so, should I in the last moment when an IPL game is happening, when I'm seeing the transaction rates are like 20x, 30x of the normal, and so does the failure rates increase as well. So typically, payment failure success rates for us are in the ballpark of 80 to 85%. During IPL or high octane events, like in the last 30 minutes, they drop down to like 65 to 70%. So the model automatically makes a decision whether I should ask this customer to deposit the remaining 5 rupees or just give them the discount of 5 rupees, because it makes more business sense for me to give them a discount and a better customer experience in that point of time. So deploying these kind of strategies, I think, is paramount. As Vikas rightly said, being a real money game and like touching those kind of things in at the very last moment when these kind of events are starting and the window is very limited is very critical. So like that's why we try to limit our blast radius for our experimentations very small to a very smaller audience. And then once we see that the experimentations are resulting good results and like they're not much biases involved and things like those, then we start rolling them out to the larger audience. That is typically how we solve it.
Got it. And lots of insight there, Nitish, as well, into the world, right? And as you very rightly mentioned, right, the different approaches, limited window, there's a lot to take care and then apply it to all the audience. So that is definitely very important. And we got a very good insight on the different companies, sizes, etc. I'm just gonna quickly head to Deepak. And Deepak, I know we left our last conversation, and you mentioned A/B testing, and you brought that up. You're working for Myntra now, and earlier even with Singa, right? Both of them are very heavy when it comes to A/B testing. So have you seen the differences in the approach? And because again, being the buzzword, have you seen the approaches for these different brands, and what would be your thoughts on the entire concept?
So if I was to compare Zynga and Myntra, right, I think the basic premises of why and how we run an experiment remains exactly the same. The differences start coming once you start factoring the nature of businesses that you're in. For example, Nitish and Vikas were talking about, right, in terms of real money games, or for example, games which have certain life cycles, right? The minute you start considering the customer's life cycle and the behavior changes, the way you run experiments, the way you conduct experiments drastically change, right? For example, for us at Zynga, most of the games used to have a lifetime of about 2 to 3 years, right? And most of the revenue is captured upfront in the first 2 to 3 years, right? But with the case of Zynga, right? Sorry, the case of Myntra, you have customers who've been on our platform and are loyal customers for the last, I don't know, 8, 9 years, ever since its inception. You've got a new set of customers coming on board. There's seasonality in its business, right? So the way in which you construct and design experiments in itself changes, right? Zynga, I think perhaps like Amit had rightly pointed out, right, was a very large company, and I think had an unfair advantage in terms of building those infrastructure services upfront very, very early on, which kind of gave it a headway in terms of conducting some incredible types of experiments. I think I would say that's true for a lot of valley-based companies in India. I think we're starting to catch on the wave of how to conduct experiments and build those kind of deep infrastructures. I think if you to look at, let's say, for example, Amit, I think you worked at Microsoft, and I think there's this man called Ronnie Kahavi, who was, I think, the experiment god. And I think a lot of us still look up to him to see what is the right way of conducting experiments, right? I think the kind of learnings that have come, which have been conducted over these years, have started to percolate here. And I think we're starting to apply those principles here. But the difference comes in terms of the business challenges, right? For example, if I was to compare with very clearly between Zynga and Myntra, right? In Zynga, it's all about capturing revenue instantaneously, right? How much revenue can you capture today? How many customers can you send out invite to get the virality quotient going? But it's a lot more complicated when it comes to Myntra, right? If I were to optimize for short-term revenue, I might lose out on long-term customer lifetime value, right? We have situations where customers return, and we therefore try to run experiments to influence what is the right kind of products they pick. It might result in revenue dipping today, but it might therefore also improve customer retention over the long term and therefore LTV. Running these kind of experiments become very, very challenging in itself. And you have different groups, right? Different business groups coming together, and each of them are trying to do their own local area optimization, right? The challenge then is at the scale at which Myntra today operates is probably to have the right kind of governance principles to how do you infer experiments. You have different business groups, you have different product groups, each of them trying to run their own experiments. How do you then build a common experimentation council, which has a generalized framework to evaluate all incoming experiments, infer those, and therefore take the right decisions for the organization, which creates value for customers today and as well as long-term values, right? With that being said, perhaps there are certain key things that we've learned in the past, and what I've probably learned through probably at an accelerated pace since I've joined Myntra, in terms of how we should be conducting these experiments. Probably when I was at Zynga, I was probably a consumer of this playbook. I was very, very early in my life. So I never had the reason to sit and think about these complex problem statements. I was a probably very junior PM saying that, this is the framework, I just follow it. But today, when we're in a situation where we have to define the right frameworks to help an organization make decisions, I think from the world of experimentation, first and foremost, I think the lessons learned the hard way is picking the right metrics for inferring. I cannot overemphasize the importance of the right metrics. More often than not, we always, I mean, most companies, at least in the poll that I ran yesterday as well, most people say, I want to optimize for revenue growth. But revenue is a very, very downstream metric, right? Let's say you're conducting an experiment on the homepage. There are many, many things that happen between the homepage and the final checkout, which could diminish that outcome in itself. So the key is picking the right kind of metrics, and therein comes certain challenges, right? There are different types of metrics, right? We call these as binomial metrics or continuous metrics, discrete metrics, right? Each of these have their own statistical techniques to conclude inferences as well, right? So if you don't understand the nature of metrics, you might end up not having the right sample size. You might not adequately power your experiment correctly. You might choose the right kind of detectable effects upon which you run the experiments. And therefore, what might happen is you might conclude an experiment prematurely and call it a success. And that might have huge business ramifications in itself. So our recommendation usually here is, if you're going down the path of experimentation, spend time understanding the nuances of designing experiments, understand the nature of statistics, and also build some degree of deep understanding of statistics. It goes a long, long way in making meaningful inferences, right? Second and most common mistake, we often than not make poor instrumentation choices, right? How you define your logic for instrumentation can greatly define the outcome, right? For example, we had once a debate saying, checkout metric has gone up. It's only when we then realize that how does the checkout metric go up, that the instrumentation logic in itself was very different, right? It goes counter to how we thought about it, right? So before you run an experiment, always do a sanctity check to understand how is the logic behind instrumentation functioning, because that's what gives you final output. And if that instrumentation logic is poor or it's weak, you might end up having a lot of false positives. Third, invest a lot of time into understanding errors and biases. Cannot overemphasize the importance of this. I think Amit has talked briefly about this as well. I think one of the key practices that we follow is running AA tests continuously around the clock, right? You cannot know when there's bias creeping into your experiments, right? It may appear that the traffic is split equal, or you may think there is homogeneity between groups, but if you really don't know if there's homogeneity, it really, really becomes difficult. And there are many situations where the experiments that you run can have effects which are non-causal to behavior. For example, if you launch a shiny new button, you are going to see a lot of incremental spikes on probably the first 2 to 3 days, and thereafter it flattens out. And if you don't know that there is something called as a primacy effect or a novelty effect, you will not factor them as part of your inferences, and you will not exclude those biases as well. So a lot of challenges, and most importantly, don't pick multiple metrics as well when it comes to running experiments. Lots of challenges there. The more experiments or the more metrics that you pick up, the odds of finding one false positive metric in that also dramatically increases, right? And don't hunt for metrics after concluding an experiment. This is something that's very, very common across business leaders, product managers. Like, what if this metric could have gone up by virtue of the running this experiment? That was not part of your original hypothesis. So if you're trying to hunt for metrics post an experiment, more often than not, you're seeking to validate a bias that you already have and not seeking for true causality at the end of the day. I can probably give another long, long list of the don'ts at this point of time, but I think that these were probably the most important differences that I've seen as part of building playbooks. What I learned at Zynga and what I think are making a big difference today while we're doing this at Myntra at this point of time.
Deepak, very well said. And I think, one bottom line there would be to answer the question right. In experimentation, it's very difficult to get the question or the hypothesis right. That is what will change the game. And all of that with a lot of patience, a lot of knowledge of the process. So that is very, very important. Unfortunately, we have like a couple of plethora of questions, but the problem is we're running out of time. And as we had anticipated previously as well, but Amit, Vikas, Nitish, Deepak, thank you so much. We will be getting back to you with the questions because our audience really is very, very, enthusiastic about those. But right now, we would not have time to answer those questions as of now. So thank you so much again for your time. This was a very insightful session. I think getting so different perspectives from different brands and even from, all the speakers here, you all gave us like different perspective, the product, the different kind of industries, brands. So it was an amazing session. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Akansha. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Akansha. It was a pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Thank you so much.